I was 15 when I wrote my first paid book review, commissioned by my father, Chaitow, for the journal he was then editor-in-chief of. This was the Journal of Alternative and Complementary Therapies. If I remember correctly, the book I was reviewing had something to do with the use of alternative therapies in veterinary settings. My first attempt was pretty sloppy. I used flimsy generalizations and arguments which he eventually edited appropriately before publishing it and paying me a whole £15 for what was a pretty sorry effort. His words to me once he explained his edits were, "Don't be a flake, or nobody will ever respect you." I had to ask him to explain his definition of a flake, to which he replied, "Someone who makes wild claims based on no or shaky evidence, or who tries to dress up that evidence in flowery language to make it sound scientific." In the years that followed, with his sharp pen always hovering over my early ventures into writing for an audience, I developed quite a keen radar for flakiness. And those years took me deep into the territory of New Age and pagan philosophies and ideas, because that's where I found fascinating stories that inspired me to paint. I delved deeply into the history of alchemy and esoteric traditions, and following my earlier studies, eventually came away with a master's degree in something called the history of Western esotericism, seen through a hybrid lens of historical research methods, social science, and literary scholarship. Basically, this field studies the history, content, and cultural impact of a cluster of philosophical, religious, and mystical traditions that for centuries were neglected by both mainstream thought and later by academia. One reason why it is important is because studying it fills in many gaps in our understanding of how and why certain belief systems had an effect on society and culture. At the time when I first began these studies, which was about 15 years ago, the field of what is now called Western esotericism was in its infancy, with 3 university chairs in Europe, at the Sorbonne in France, the University of Amsterdam, and the newly inaugurated chair at the University of Exeter in the UK, which is where I was privileged to attend. And there were also 2 scholarly networks, one in the US, the ASC, and one in Europe, which organised conferences and set the tone for this field of study. My fellow students and I, embarking on this master's degree, quickly discovered that actually we had become unintentional pioneers. The founders of the field had fought long and hard to convince established academia that Western esotericism was even worth studying. And they fought many battles to develop methodologies and scholarship that could stand up to the scrutiny of rigorous academic interrogation. It took years, but they were eventually successful in attaining a grudging kind of tolerance for the field. But as students, we were quickly made to understand that we were going to have to work much, much harder than our colleagues down the hall, studying, say, medieval history or comparative literature in order to prove ourselves. Basically, we, the students, were our professors' gamble with the system. They were going to have to prove that this department even deserved to exist through the quality of our output. So if our colleagues down the hall had to be good, we had to be superlative. Our professors were exacting, demanding, and rigorous, and the reason was that the field had to be seen as following the letter of the academic method. We could not afford, the field could not afford to be seen as flakes. Or to put it bluntly, to be seen as a bunch of occult weirdos pretending to be academics by those who could not yet see the value of this field. The reason being that it was too young to have produced enough scholarship with which to convince colleagues in neighbouring fields. So that MA degree, and this was back in 2005, 6, 7. This was one of the hardest schools I've ever encountered. And after successfully earning it, I then embarked on a PhD exploring the history of ideas through the work of an eccentric and fairly obscure French author. And within that context, I wrote an intellectual history of his ideas and influences. Now, an intellectual history includes the whole spectrum of ideas that go into influencing somebody to produce whatever they produce, whatever their life's work is. So you don't just list them, you have to look into them and understand how these ideas actually impacted this person's thought so they produced what they did. So this took me into the history of mesmerism, the birth of homeopathy, and the birth of psychology, and looking at how these ideas emerged, evolved, and impacted culture as the 20th century dawned. So our research was always about how ideas are born, how they travel, how they evolve, what forms they take, and what aspects of society and human endeavour they impact, and how they impact it, what the results are, what the phenomena are. So it's big. I'll never forget my professor returning my first draft PhD chapter to me. And among his many comments and criticisms, he had locked onto a statement I had made about some rather historical tradition that had influenced the author I was studying. Now, I'd given a citation supporting my statement, which was some historical statement, but I had said nothing about the tradition. I simply said, so-and-so was influenced by X tradition, and that was it. So in his comment, my professor listed several sources that actually not only underpin the history of that tradition, but actually developing on the content, and then extra commentary within this footnote that I had omitted to explain why the sources mattered, how they put the picture together. His comment read, "This is what a citation needs to look like." So basically we needed 6 sources where everybody else needed 1 or 2 in other fields. We needed to be better than the best. Or, we were told, the field would lose its credibility, which was shaky at the time, and the courses would be shut down. So we did as we were asked, and I think most of us made it through. In parallel with with my PhD studies, and at my father's strong encouragement, I founded an online academy and headed up a faculty of 12 scholars to provide outreach courses and events that offered a careful, strongly academic grounding in these ideas for people unlikely to seek advanced academic degrees. It was aimed more at kind of undergraduate level. I wanted to debunk some of the misconceptions surrounding the topics covered by esotericism, and to offer those interested in understanding more a reliable set of courses and sources to draw on, but something that was also accessible and easy to understand for the non-specialist. So I hope to contribute to clarifying the value of the academic approach in these areas. The hope was, of course, that this would go some way towards reducing, improving on the bad reputation of our area of study among the general public. And also to encourage people in other fields of study and other disciplines to seek advanced degrees, such as the MA that I had just graduated from. And I had 2 key aims in mind: academic outreach and to break down the disciplinary boundaries that separated my field from literature, history, art history, and others. Now, basically all of these disciplines can look at the same thing, can be studying the same thing, but they use a slightly different set of tools to do so. And the boundaries between them it's a very similar situation to the boundaries, say, separating physiotherapists from chiropractors, from massage therapists, from osteopaths, with very, very similar dynamics between those fields. More on that another time, although it's very much worth exploring more. So at first, my new academy was greeted with strong suspicion by senior scholars in my field, many of whom thought that my colleagues and I might go too far in dumbing down the careful scholarship, somehow embarrassing or damaging the field by reaching out to the general public instead of keeping it all in the academy and raising our academic profile. At my own university, I was severely criticised for getting involved with outreach work. I was told that I should reserve my efforts for the highest levels of academia and not squander my energy. I was attacked by peers of my own generation who accused me of dragging down the field by reframing academic scholarship in language the public could understand. So basically, I was taking our precious academic knowledge and giving it to the unappreciative public, or so that's how they saw it. And at the same time, my supervisors were also extremely unhappy with me. I caused a lot of fuss in those years. My supervisors were very unhappy with me for daring to take an interdisciplinary approach to my PhD work instead of the prescribed methodology for approaching studies in this area. Now, my aim was to create a fit-for-purpose framework for working with ideas that would cross more than one discipline. So, for example, if you have an illustrated work of literature that may include ideas, may have ideas that draw on mystical beliefs and early scientific explorations, you've got illustration, you've got a belief system, you've got early science, which is actually happening in the time that this book has been written. Okay, so in order to actually get into it and unlock it and understand it, you need methods that come from 4 different disciplines. So history's needed, you need literary scholarship and scholarly techniques, you need a little bit of sociology to put together the pieces of how this fits into the context of the time, art history, because you have illustration, you need to understand how those things hook together, and you need a little bit of communication studies to again contextualize it, but also see it as something that communicates. It's a book. Books communicate. Only using one of these would have meant slicing the work into pieces and just looking at one side of it. So say you've got this whole book to study and you're just looking at the illustrations, but you don't talk about the book they came from. Now and it is an extreme example, that's an oversimplified example, but that's how it looked to me, and it looked wrong. However, my tutors insisted that if I was going to take my interdisciplinary approach, I would have to justify every single aspect by using the full array of academic justification to demonstrate why it was necessary, because they would have wanted a clear historical rigid approach, which essentially would only look at one side of things. So I fought many, many battles over those years to overcome these suspicions, and I faced a lot of resistance from my own colleagues and professors. I had many tearful discussions with my father when I came close to quitting out of the sheer pressure of it all. I no longer knew whether it was worth the effort at some point. However, he used examples from his own career to show me the value of the PhD that I was pursuing, because this wasn't about getting letters after my name. It was about acquiring thinking skills, writing skills, and honing them, and learning to create arguments and to deconstruct arguments. So if I disagree with someone, I need to actually be able to unpick that and then respond to it and justify what I say. So essentially, it was about gaining these skills so that I could then use them for goals that were meaningful to me. And he pointed out his own evolution towards a more academic direction, from his years as strictly as a clinician into teaching, into hands-on education and practical teaching, and into the books for the general public, and from there into the textbooks, and further and further into the research community, and as somebody who essentially tried to bridge the world of clinicians and researchers. So it was my father who essentially initiated me into the complex tangle of the bodywork field. And it was through his experience that he encouraged me to use my skills, the skills I was acquiring, for outreach and not for the ivory tower. And he showed me through his own work how this could have an impact and be so much more satisfying and so much more meaningful. So I stuck with it despite the odds, and for a few years I also kept my academy running quite successfully. So, with the support of a few dedicated and like-minded colleagues in those days, I staged international academic conferences in 3 different countries, in the US, in the UK, and Greece. Delivered plenty of lectures, ran courses, wrote articles in cultural journals for general readership, academic journals to make sure my academic profile was up to scratch in 3 different languages, I think, I was writing at one point. So, yeah, it was a busy time, and for my PhD, I created an interdisciplinary methodology, which was the first of its kind within my field, that openly challenged the approaches and methods that had been proposed by the very founders of the field. And in the end, I was awarded my degree without corrections. In the British system, pass without corrections is the highest possible result in that system. And the following year, I was invited to share my interdisciplinary methodology roadmap. I called it a roadmap for scholars, with a consortium of senior scholars from all over the world in related fields, where it was really an exercise in building bridges between our disciplines. So what I'd been calling for over the past 5 years, and had taken flack for at the time, was finally happening. Interdisciplinarity wasn't a dirty word anymore. And senior scholars were now calling for more interaction between disciplines. And so, this roadmap of mine was published a couple of years after that. Around the same time, I shut the academy because I found the time constraints and demands too stifling. It wasn't a vehicle that was working for me, and I preferred to continue doing the same work, but in a more freelance, independent way. I'd abandoned the idea of chasing a career in formal academia because I had many different aspects of many different pursuits. And this gave me more freedom as an independent scholar to balance my teaching, my writing, my painting, etc. It is true, though, that I became quite jaded with formal academia for a while, and the demands it places on anyone wishing to participate in it. And it was around this time I started also focusing a lot more on teaching and skills training and education for especially for the young adult classroom. Yet the beautiful irony was that within the same year that I had started, I'd earned the PhD and felt quite jaded about it, and sort of it still wasn't quite clear whether it had been worth all the trouble. The universities that had fought me began outreach programs of their own, directed at the public, and senior scholars, who today I am very proud to call my friends, began producing books and articles and lectures geared to a more general audience. And then the younger scholars followed. So, and despite having closed the academy, I kept getting calls to resurrect my courses and teach them to various groups. So since then, these endeavours have flourished, and I've been delighted to watch them evolve. So the point is, I'm certainly not trying to take credit for what other colleagues did. These developments were independent and happened at a slightly later stage. But I do know that I began that debate and contributed to it, and this brought the knock-on effect. Now, my career might have taken a different, easier, and certainly a safer direction if I had just kept my head down and played teacher's pet. Yet today, just 10 years on, my field is broader, better accepted, and more open than ever, with more university courses and more universities hosting programs on these topics, with aspects of esoteric history embedded in their proper place in the history of ideas. I can now talk to colleagues in other fields without getting funny looks. I can easily point to the significance of my field in relation to theirs. I can make this video without being concerned about directly, openly naming my field of study. It's earned its place in the academy. And in relation to my father's work, I'm very proud to have also covered several areas in the medical humanities and medical history directly within my PhD research, even though neither of us actually realised that at the time. But most importantly, what these experiences gave me was the ability to move between disciplines and fields, find the commonalities, and in many cases, bridge the differences. Now, my father supported and encouraged and advised me throughout this journey. It was he who spurred me on to create the academy, to organise those conferences, and he who advised and supported me when I was under attack. He never let me play it safe or feel sorry for myself, but he always did emphasise what he had told me when I was 15. Don't be a flake. Do the work, get it right, don't compromise your integrity, don't leave yourself open to accusations of sloppiness, and stay humble. Don't be afraid to admit when you're wrong or when you simply don't know something. And he led by example. He had the unique perspective of someone who had watched naturopathy and osteopathy follow a very similar route. And he had the honour of being the first osteopath to be appointed by the British government to a medical practice belonging to the National Health Service, the British National Health Service. He understood the importance of changing the system by gaining respect, by learning the language of the system one wants to enter, and by then using rational argument and the system's own tools to coax the changes needed into being. He didn't fight the establishment. He found ways of making it an ally. But he did that the same way that my field earned its own respectability, by placing the bar high, by not allowing himself to be considered a flake, admitting when his earlier ideas had been shown to be mistaken, and allowing the progress of science to inform his work. By establishing the Journal of Bodywork and Movement Therapies, he provided a unique forum where it was possible to build an interdisciplinary evidence base for the bodywork professions. And he encouraged young researchers and clinicians to contribute to ongoing dialogue, so that this dialogue between clinicians and researchers could continue, but always at a standard that can stand up to close scrutiny. He did not rest easy on his successes. This is a long, slow process that can only be achieved through very painstaking work. And there will always be room for valid criticism of these things, whether it's the field I've been talking about, whether it's the scientific methods. It's the only way that we can have progress is through constructive dialogue and constructive criticism. That resistance is an opportunity for improvement. And as long as those disagreements stand on a platform of rational and reasoned, respectful, well-researched debate, they can change the face of a field for the better. My father achieved that in the many fields he touched, and I think I've contributed to it in my own field. We did that by understanding where this resistance was coming from, respecting it, getting behind it, getting inside it, learning its language, and following its rules, not by mocking it or seeing it as an enemy to be eliminated. There is room for more than one perspective, and more than one perspective is needed because no one field can ever hold the whole truth. The world works a certain way. It is imperfect. It's made by the world we work in, these things called academia, these things called the scientific community. They are human and they are inherently flawed. But at the same time, they have a lot of room and a lot of dynamics for positive change as well. After all, a tree that bends with the wind does not easily break. So both my father and I worked with the system and through the system, not by launching a full-pronged attack on it. I used these new languages and tools to build to address what I saw as problematic in my own field, and it got results. So this is my aim in my current approach to writing and developing courses in both research skills and literacy, as well as writing for the sciences for bodywork students and professionals. The aim is to build bridges. So when I read the article on pseudoscience in Nature Worldview that formed the starting point for this column in Massage and Bodywork, it felt like history was repeating itself. My father had seen this kind of debate open at least half a dozen times, and he's written about it. I'd seen it a couple of times myself, though never on such a scale, and never with so many communication tools at our fingertips. So there seems to be a unique opportunity to join a dialogue and to contribute to strengthening rather than weakening the professions and overlapping bodywork and integrative health fields in the face of what will probably become a new public understanding of science. This pandemic was always going to bring a sea change, and this may be a tremendous opportunity to participate in it for the benefit of those fields which have suffered from fragmentation and misperception for decades. There will be resistance, there will be scrutiny, and there will certainly be prejudice. But this is an incredibly unique opportunity to raise the quality bar, improve the level of dialogue and evidence, address inherent problems, put aside old differences, and find ways to benefit the professions that will be impacted by a change in communication dynamics from the scientific community. A carefully thought out whisper, though, will be heard much more effectively than shrieks and cackles on social media. I think of social media as something as like a town square. Everybody and their cat can go stand on a soapbox and make some noise. But carefully written articles, using the language and the tools available, written in the right venues, development of the necessary skills, focused conferences, judicious use of the media, and interdisciplinary bridges, let's learn to talk to each other, can have an immensely positive effect. There is no space for ideology, ego, or flakiness in this dialogue. For my part, I will continue to contribute to the dialogue from a lens that straddles the humanities and the sciences, because interdisciplinarity is as close as it gets to holistic thinking in modern academia. I very much hope that in some small way it will inspire others to do the same.